Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag.
Coming up next is the 107th episode of Between the Covers, the 7th of the new year. One I'm particularly excited to share with you, a conversation with John Keene, the author of Counternarratives, one of my highlight reads of the last decade. But before we begin, I wanted to alert you that you can go to patreon.com/betweenthecovers and support the show. And there you will also find out ways you can receive a copy of the out-of-print co-written book Vera and Linus by Jesse Ball. You can also check out the growing archive of bonus material there, again at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer, poet, and translator John Keene. John Keene is the chair of the African American and African Studies Department at Rutgers University, Newark, where he is also a professor of English and a teacher of creative writing. A graduate of Harvard University and NYU, Keene has taught at NYU, Brown, and Northwestern, been an editor at Callaloo, a journal of African diaspora arts and letters, a board member of the African Poetry Book Fund, a longstanding member of the Dark Room Collective, a Cave Canem Fellow, and a recipient of the Whiting Award for his fiction and poetry. His first book, Annotations, was a book that troubled the line between novel and memoir, with a prose described as having a poem-like compression. Annotations was published in 1995 by New Directions and described by Kirkus as a tour de force of intelligence, wordsmithing, and passion, and by Publishers Weekly as worthy of the highest recommendation, pointing to a new direction for literary fiction in the 21st century. John Keene is also the author of the 2006 poetry art collection Seismosis, a collaboration with the artist Christopher Stackhouse, the 2014 translation of the Brazilian writer Hilda Hilst's novel Letters from a Seducer. And since 2002, John Keene has also created a series of public and durational conceptual events under the name The Emotional Outreach Project, which has been exhibited in galleries in both Brooklyn and Berlin. John Keene is here today to talk about his three latest books, his collection of novellas and stories, Counternarratives from New Directions, his poetry chapbook, Playland from Seven Kitchens Press, and his book of image text entitled Grind, a collaboration with the photographer Nicholas Molnar out from ITI Press. Counternarratives was the winner of the American Book Award and the Lannan Literary Award for Fiction. It was also the winner of the inaugural Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses, a unanimous decision by the judges who called Counternarratives a once-in-a-generation achievement for short-form fiction. Its subject matter, its formal inventiveness, its multitude of voices, and its seriousness of purpose transform a series of thematically linked stories into a complete work of art. Kate Webb, writing for the Times Literary Supplement, adds that the ambition, erudition, and epic sweep of Keene's remarkable new collection of stories, traveling from the beginnings of modernity to modernism, place it in a class of its own. Counternarratives achieves no less than an imaginative repositioning of the history of the Americas. Welcome to Between the Covers, John Keene.
Thank you so much, David.
So I'd like to start out with counternarratives and this idea of counternarratives having an epic sweep. The book moves through centuries over a span of nearly 500 years.
It crosses oceans. It takes place in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, and in Africa. There is an ever-present sense of movement of bodies across time and place, of disparate cultures coming into contact and conflict, of global trade. But while there is this sense of scope and almost a limitless scope, there is really a constraint to this project, or a framing to this project. We don't get stories in Vietnam. We don't get stories in Afghanistan. We don't get stories that are 1,000 or 4,000 years old. So tell us a little bit about the scope and framing for this particular project.
Well, that's a wonderful reading, and I think your point is a very good one. The real sort of background to the collection is the idea of the Black Atlantic, I guess you could say, the Atlantic, circum-Atlantic, and the scope, temporal scope, really runs from the dawn of modernity, right? I mean, what is the moment in which, when we think about the moment of the Enlightenment, the sort of late Renaissance in Europe, which is also the rise of this, kind of the moment of proto-capitalism, and also the rise of the slave system, right, which really sort of transforms not just the Americas, but of course, Europe itself, Africa, parts of Asia, et cetera. So that is kind of the beginning, and the kind of end of this arc for the book is modernism, right? So what happens in modernism? So once you get to kind of a moment of tremendous technological progress on the one hand, right, and capitalism, industrial capitalism is underway, and we're thinking about this moment right before, the end of colonialism. So colonialism is on shaky ground. That is the arc that I was really sort of interested in. And I will say that the final story in the book sort of takes place today. It's kind of in time and out of time, but it actually sort of reflects back on all that's come before, because the people who are kind of central to it are people who have been, whose power, whose very, ways of being have been made possible by colonialism and its aftermath. So that really kind of provides a way of thinking about what's in the book. You mentioned, for example, Vietnam, and you mentioned like all of these other, I think we can think about important flashpoints. I mean, the war in Algeria, et cetera, that are connected. And I think I think if I'd had like 1,000 pages and endless amounts of time, I would have, there were stories that actually didn't make it into the book. And I actually, as I've said a few times in interviews, I even had an earlier version of this book that I lost. I lost most of the stories when my computer crashed, but there were sort of proto stories that were set at other points. But the 13, I think, work together in interesting ways. They're in conversation with each other. And as I said in an very early interview with Brooke Gladstone, one of the things that became clear is that that every story in the collection almost has a kind of twin, and I see this as there's a kind of resonance that gives the collection itself a feeling of even greater depth than it might originally appear to have, but also gives it also sort of expands that epic quality, right, and also allows it to sort of speak to things that aren't even discussed in the book, because when I'm talking about one thing, you realize that this actually is applicable to something else that happened in history.
One of the things that I really found most remarkable about the book Counternarratives was the way you troubled the notion of objectivity. Mm-hmm. So it adopts language of reportage or authority and then troubles it. You have stories that emulate historical documents in form and language, that of history books, newspaper clippings, excerpts of official reports, letters, journal entries, a monograph with a 75-page footnote that is mostly the story, right. And then one story that's spoken to a reporter. Right. Even though it's spoken by a fictional character reimagined from Mark Twain, we get this sense of it being objective in a sense because he's talking to, even though it's a fictional reporter, a reporter nonetheless.
Right.
And then you use these archaic literary idioms. Mm-hmm. Ben Ehrenreich says that you're adapting the linguistic conventions of white supremacy And it made me think also of a previous guest, Yoon Sung Kim, who talks about the white cube of freedom, adopting a language that regards itself as value-free and abstracted from context. But what really makes the book charged and so compelling to me is that you've adopted this form, and then within the form, you are doing everything to undermine it in a sense. So you're the way you frame the story, who's telling the story, what's the point of view, what's the movement of the narrative arc. And it made me think of this idea of almost like you're doing this revolutionary literary sabotage. And there's this quote by Fred Moten that you probably know, I'm guessing, but when he's talking about the relationship between Black culture and American culture, he said, yes, this brutal structure was built on our backs, but if that was the case, it was so that when we stood up, it would crumble. And I feel like there's something about that dynamic that each of these stories sort of exemplifies, of like you creating the superstructure almost of oppression and then having someone stand up in it that is making it crumble. How does that sound to you as a description?
Well, I think it's definitely on the mark. I mean, I would say that my goal was, and it's interesting. Some of the reviews have sort of looked at the book and kind of focused on the idea that it's all about oppression. But one of the things I think that you see again and again in these stories is the kind of at the same time the kind of joy, sort of intracultural, intra-racial joy, community, right? In the midst of such a tremendous precarity that these characters are experiencing. So that it's. I wanted to give a kind of fuller sense of the Black experience, and not just and of course the people of color, because we think about the complexities of Blackness in the Americas, but to give a sense of the fullness, so that the stories are not solely about oppression, but they do have this. The other side, which is, or I'm going to say the other side, but sort of the complement that you get to see glimpses of these characters' lives, even within this kind of larger framework in which they are able to kind of, to the extent possible, be themselves, be free, right? Central to this collection is the idea of freedom. I mean, what does freedom mean, especially when on so many levels you're being policed, your speech, your selfhood, everything is so radically and brutally delimited in certain ways. What does it then mean to be free? And how does the mind itself, kind of seek out and create those possibilities, those moments, those, little nodes of freedom, right? That aren't only just individual, but they can become collective, right? And that I see as, really what liberation in the multiple political senses is about. So I think you're definitely onto something. I mean, I also would say that, for example, in that story, an outtake from the ideological origins of the American Revolution, it always fascinates me that very few people Google that title, because the title refers directly to a really landmark study. I think it won the Pulitzer Prize by Bernard Bailyn, which is all about the New England, I think predominantly New England colonists, right? And in the moment before the American Revolution, and it was really sort of a landmark historical intervention, because he sort of challenged the prevailing view of, what led the colonists to break with Great Britain. And I think he sort of talks about the different classes of people in that book. I mean, it's been a very long time since I've read it. He talks about different classes of people, but he's really sort of thinking through ideas, et cetera. And I kind of believe I don't know if he actually singles out any Black people, but it's almost as if this whole component, these figures who, as we know, in the Boston massacre, as we know, when we think about just the first body given, American body given in defense of American freedom, was a Black man, Crispus Attucks, a mixed race person. That Bailyn and so many figures, I mean, they just kind of write all of these figures out of these people, right? An entire group of people kind of out of the narrative. And so it sort of struck me that I mean, what would it mean to engage Balin and engage this history of ideas, but also in a certain way kind of deflect it? So I think when Ben Ehrenreich is talking about the language of white supremacy, I mean, he's basically indicting, the language of, really sort of standard and really kind of highly praised historiography. I mean, I'm not saying Balin is a white supremacist, but I mean, what does it mean? Just, yes, to write, people out of a narrative that becomes, and then that writing out, which isn't maybe intentional, it might be incidental, but then that becomes the basis on which we are about and through which we talk about the origins of this country, such that I saw just online the other day someone was replying on I can't remember where it was, but they were replying. They were saying, the United States wasn't founded on racism, and it's like. Okay, well, what do you call settler colonialism? There were people here, and they were, I'm telling you, they were wiped out, or they were violently displaced, right? And that's only a sliver of the story. So, how can you say that? But, there's this also kind of innocence project of a way in this country. So part of what I was challenging is that innocence, right? Innocence about our past and about our present.
And if we look at counter-narratives as a way that you've written these erased stories back into the story, but using this official language. So we have the stories centering on the servant, the slave or the former slave or the assistant. And in giving these counter-narratives, you're sort of revealing these counter-selves. And it reminds me, it makes me feel like Du Bois's double consciousness, but like triple or quadruple consciousness, because we get the baptized Blacks who have a truer name for themselves, that is their true name, and we have the crypto or converso Jews who are behaving publicly as Christians, and then we have queer characters who are where the public narrative about them has elided their queerness. So we have all these different levels, and some of these intersections are contained within one character. But I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit about language and naming in regards to the constitution of narrative, counter-selves, secret lives, and code switching as it relates to you putting this narrative together.
Well, the idea of naming is really important. And in my very first book, Annotations, one of the things that happens a lot is, I was very interested in this idea of, what names mean, what names evoke. So all throughout that book, there are all of these references to place sites in Missouri and St. Louis, where I was born and grew up, references to sort of historical figures, often African-American, but not only African-American, references to, songs that I heard growing up. Like, for example, last night when I was at Reed and was signing books, one of the students I met told me her name was Naima. And it turns out, I said, well, I mentioned Naima in my first book. And she said, yes. And I met Nathaniel Mackey and his daughter's name Naima, and after the Coltrane song. And I said, yeah, because when I was a kid, we listened to it a lot. To me, names are very, very important, because they have such resonance. What I also was thinking about, growing up as a little kid in the 70s, was the movement among so many African American people to sort of change their names. There was the idea that you're getting rid of your slave name or your government name or the name of your oppressor, right? Even though, of course, one of the interesting things I think we're now coming to realize is that after the end of slavery, many people, many newly freed African Americans, actually, invented all kinds of interesting names, right? They created names for themselves. Sometimes they took the name of the slave owner or the plantation, et cetera. But others created, altogether new names for themselves. But anyway, I say all this to say that, names carry tremendous power. And, not only do they carry power, but to name someone or something is, we can say, an act of power, but also an act of knowledge, right? So the book is really often playing with this question of naming and how naming relates to knowledge and to power and to selfhood, right? And how one name may be imposed upon you, but you have a secret name that is a kind of a source of succor, a source of a source of resistance, right? Or you think about like sort of with passing and covering, right? These strategies that people use to survive. I think all of those things are activated by names. So that was one of the things that I think this is kind of it's like a thread woven throughout, but it definitely is related to questions of power, questions of resistance, questions of knowledge.
I think it might have been in an interview you did for Annotations when you talked about the history of St. Louis and were mentioning that people spoke French to each other, to their horses, but not to their black slaves, and mentioned how people are critical of African-American vernacular, but really everybody has multiple layers of language and different contexts in which they're using different languages, that it's not unique to any person. That there are switching in language for everybody in different contexts.
Oh, sure. I mean, actually, I think it's actually quoted in Annotations that I can't remember who the person was, but they actually did speak French. Where is it? Yes, a leading citizen. This is Audrey L. Olson, St. Louis Germans, 1850 to 1920, and in this is what Olson says. A leading citizen wrote in 1818 that the prevailing language of the white persons on the streets was French. The Negroes of the town spoke French. All the inhabitants used French to the Negroes, their horses, and their dogs. So yeah, so everyone was speaking a little Francais at that time. But yes, and this of course relates to naming. I mean, I think about, on the one hand, there was this, in the 1970s, probably even the late 60s, after the Black Power movement took hold. But of course, I also think about, probably even before that, because I went to school with kids who had, African names. So I think it was in the consciousness of parents, maybe even from the late 50s on, but really kind of took hold in the late 60s and in the 70s. First of all, the idea of, sort of changing your name completely, right? So sometimes it was related to religion. I know people who became black Muslims or Muslims and took Islamic names, Arabic names. People who chose African names, people who named their children, gave their children African names, right? And then, of course, the long tradition of sort of inventing names among African Americans. But of course, we think about how now there've been these really sort of fascinating, sociological studies that show, people are punished. If you have a name that's more black sounding, it's harder to get a job, et cetera. So I think there's a tremendous, it sort of comes from this long history that has its origins in those early moments that I'm writing about in the book, and it's all interwoven. But I also want us to think about, when we're talking about things like the vernacular and popular culture. I was saying to someone last night that one of the things that always kind of amazes me is how we don't think or talk about, for example, how popular blackface minstrelsy was, but that at one point was kind of one of the chief popular cultural artifacts of American culture. And the half-life of blackface minstrelsy, of those images, of those songs, etc., which were often attempts by whites to access black vernacular, sometimes as a way of a kind of active resistance against the kind of predominant or prevailing culture, right? This idea that you would sort of embody this black person and, in a really kind of ridiculous mode, but it's also a way of challenging kind of the sort of expectations of, white manhood or, modes of respectability for white people. I mean, I think that's so fascinating because it carries down even to today to, we can go back, let's say 50 years to someone like Norman Mailer's Black Negro, a white Negro. But then even coming forward today, and we think about, with like the ways in which hip hop is kind of been transformed by white rappers and stuff like that. And, I think about like sort of black, gay, vernacular language that kind of diffuses throughout the society. So you'll have someone on, a TV show, would not want to have anything to do with a black gay person, and and then they're saying yes, things like this. So it's sort of it's kind of interesting how American culture works and how dynamic it is. But I do think that on the there's tremendous power in these cultural modes that often are kind of marginalized or pushed to the wayside, basically, that we don't really talk about and think through carefully.
Well, on that note, you had one interviewer call you a speculative fiction writer and sort of place you within the tradition of Afrofuturism and Afro-surrealism. And you've talked about that blackness isn't just otherness, but also sort of the forerunners of innovation that get adopted by the culture later on. So there is this sort of futurist aspect to the idea of blackness, not just an othering, but both. Can you talk a little bit about how you see yourself in relationship to that tradition, if at all? I know you mentioned you make a nod to Samuel Delany, for instance, and do you see your work in conversation with sort of an Afrofuturist tradition?
Sure. I mean, I definitely think that, I don't, that's not a term that I regularly, I don't say, oh, I'm an Afrofuturist, but of course, I think, of course, I'm in dialogue with, Samuel Delany and Octavia Butler, and, going further back, people like, Rudolph Fisher, et cetera. I think that, there is a kind of powerful futurity that we see again and again and again in African American culture, right? It, in fact, because it has to, it exists both within and outside. That dynamic, that kind of dialectic, gives it often a sense of futurity, and suggests that this is what's to come, right? Because we have to be thinking about what's happening down the road. We can't ever be too comfortable in this society. So I think there are elements, sort of overt speculative elements in Counternarratives that I think I think they can be read in a lot of different ways. But yeah, I think Afrofuturism is a wonderful thing, and I feel honored to be considered in some ways part of it.
Like if we were to look at the way you trouble objectivity, there also feels like a way in which Counternarratives is troubling this idea of progress or progressive history. So much like the way you adopt official language, in the broadest strokes, the book seems to be told linearly, traditionally, and chronologically, but the closer you look, the weirder it really is. We get the epigraphs at the beginning of Baldwin, Moten, and Audre Lorde, and then Lorde is quoted without attribution hundreds of years ago in Brazil. And then we also open the first part, which takes place 400 years ago in Brazil, first with a contemporary newspaper clipping from the favelas in Brazil. So when I was thinking about this idea of you framing it from modernism to modernity, and you mentioned this, that also is a framing around the rise of the Enlightenment, which introduces the idea of progress and progressive history. And you've called this book yourself anti-teleological. So I was hoping maybe you could unpack that a little bit, the way time is functioning and the way this book is engaging with that notion of us improving our civilization as we move forward in time.
Well, on the one hand, I think it's fair to say, as someone like Steven Pinker has articulated, that in general, the world is, we have a lot of violence, we have a lot of wars, in the U.S. being at the center of a number of them, or involved in a number of them, right? I'm always kind of amazed when people say, oh, one of the great things is we don't have any war, we're not in a war now. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We're involved in all these wars. Come on, people, wake up. But in general, and Pinker says that, societies are less violent now than they were. And so I don't know if we call that progress, but I think there's sort of a shift in human behavior and consciousness from, let's say, 500 or 1,000 years ago. Even though the antecedents for who we are today, exist then, and we could see versions of ourselves and people of the past. But I did not want to write a sort of straight linear set of stories. I wanted to play with the idea of time and the question of timeliness and being out of time, in time and out of time. I think, again, I see it as relating to Blackness and how Blackness is produced and performed, how it's constructed, how it's lived and embodied. And, for example, with that Brazil story, one of the fascinating things to me is, Brazil's sort of official motto is, order and progress. And a kind of unofficial statement about itself is it's the country of the future, right? If you think about, I guess, if the U.S. were, going to define itself as the country of now, right? What is it, Make America Great Again or whatever? So I guess we were great at some point. We were the country of today. But at the same time, we see how, in both societies, in Brazil and in the United States, we have these carryovers from what really isn't such a distant past that we really haven't fully reckoned with. So in the sense that the stories try to figure out ways to both activate that past and connect it to the present, I think they're doing something that is, in a certain way, anti-teleological, right? Because many of them end on a point of openness. A number of them actually even end with ellipses, right? We don't know what's going to happen. We have to try to figure out where the story might take us in the future. You're in a basket floating off over the Confederate lines, although we know from the sort of circular nature of that story, and a number of these stories are circular, we know from the circular nature of that story that, in fact, he's able to tell the story in the future. So he must have figured out, Theodore, in The Aeronauts, he must have figured out what to do about being in that basket, and everything in the story sort of leads us to believe that. The same is true with Jim's story. The same is true with, for example, the story you mentioned on Brazil. So I was sort of fascinated by, what happens if we think about time and history in a different kind of way than we usually do, which isn't to say other people haven't done similar things before, but I was kind of interested in trying some of those approaches out in this book.
Yeah, I would love to talk about also the way we've talked a little bit about sort of centering and reclaiming counter-narratives of individuals, but you also foreground, through the choices you make, you foreground things that are erased, historical things that are erased, such as by placing a story of slavery in Massachusetts, the idea that slavery existed in some places all the way up until the Civil War in the North, that the first settler of Manhattan was a black settler, and things that are implied but not explicit, like the battle between the Dutch and the Portuguese for Brazil and how that's going to affect immigration. So the way the Jews are going to get pushed to North America because the Portuguese win rather than the Dutch.
Right.
But I wanted to talk specifically about erasure and the Civil War. I don't know if you've read Cannibal by Sophia Sinclair, but
I have.
You have,
yes,
yeah. So she was on, and that book is very informed about living in Charlottesville,
where I lived as well.
as a woman of color. And she was here just after the alt-right march, defending the statues that are everywhere commemorating the people who fought against the United States, explicitly to defend slavery.
Right.
That's weird enough to imagine that, to know that we have all these commemorations of essentially traitors to the Union, in the defense of slavery, but also the erasure of the fact that we don't have, where are these commemorations of like the black heroes or of the slaves who have died, like the absent commemorations of all the things in the North or the South. And you've mentioned that Counternarratives came out around the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. and that you noticed a conspicuous absence of a commemoration of the anniversary. So I was wanting you to just unpack that a little bit for us around that juxtaposition. Your book coming out, no commemoration for the Civil War. It's like the North won the war and the South won the narrative or something. So talk to us a little bit about that thing that you noticed.
Well, it was actually quite, well, first of all, I think that was a pure coincidence that the book came out in, the first version, the hardcover came out in 2015, and it was the 150th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. Really, I think interesting to me is that throughout that year, there could have been any number of commemorations, because of course after the actual surrender, Confederate surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, that there were a number of other battles that went on that happened, although the war was sort of officially over. But at any of those moments, I felt like President Obama and the Congress and, any number of governors could have commemorated the end of this war, which is, was the really the most violent and terrible and destructive war on U.S. soil that ever happened. I mean, it sort of dwarfs, other wars that happened on U.S. soil. And I think the absence of commemoration, the absence of discussion. I mean, the New York Times did an amazing series called, Disunion, which was remarkable. And I don't know if it's still online, but I would direct people to it, and I hope they do a book, because it was, famous historians, amateur historians, but these beautiful short pieces that were extraordinarily illuminating with maps and all kinds of documentation, things pulled from the archive and beautifully interpreted. And then, of course, everyone could comment, and anyone who was able to log into the Times could comment. And of course, there were people who would say things like, "Oh, this is a wonderful." Insightful, discussion of X. Other people would say, no, this war was just fought for states' rights. You'd get that over and over and over again. Okay, and so even when they, had the actual, quotations from Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Alexander Stephens, who gave the famous Cornerstone speech that said basically, this Confederacy is built on, the subjugation of the black person, black people, and the maintenance of slavery. You still have people saying, well, this is about states' rights. This is about, basically, saying no to the federal government. But so I felt like there was something very resonant in a beautiful way about the book appearing at that particular moment. I think that it suggests again and again and again this open with the text as a whole and in its individual parts, individual stories, it suggests this open wound that we have never, ever fully healed or even really attended to. And I think that Charlottesville demonstration was like a kind of toxin in the blood that sort of bursts forth, right? Because it was not just about the defense of Robert E. Lee, whose whole life and persona has been really sort of sanitized, but it was about a desire openly, no longer, covertly, although it's appeared in sort of numerous moments in American history in open form, openly to embody white supremacy, right? To say, here we are, these mostly young white men, marching at a campus, right? And I think it's also very significant that they picked an American university, a state university, the State University of the Old Dominion, right? Where the state where the Confederacy's main capital was. To sort of to be physically there, to be visually present, right? To have this almost a kind of ritual demonstration of a certain kind of power that is not willing to let go, right? To say, no matter what you do, we are not going to relinquish power without a fight. I think that's very telling. In terms of monuments, what has struck me, and I think there's a book out about it now, but I know the writer Tisa Bryant, who's a friend of mine, has also been writing about this a lot. She talks about how all throughout the Americas there are commemorations of the end of slavery. There are holidays. I mean, Brazil has a holiday, and of course a day of national black consciousness. The United States has Juneteenth, which is not an official holiday, and there are no, I mean, maybe there are now, of course, with the Museum of African American History, the National Museum of African American History, which is an extraordinary museum. There are some commemorations, but there's it's sort of amazing to me on one level, and then not, that in the North and South, in all of the former slave states, from what's Maine all the way west to, Missouri, there are no statues honoring the former enslaved people. And even things like renaming have been very contentious and fraught. So I'll just give you one last story. Just yesterday, I believe, there was an amazing story in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about a person named Archer Alexander. He was an enslaved man who lived in St. Charles, Missouri, which is the county just north of St. Louis County. Archer Alexander was born in Virginia. He was brought as a young person, as an enslaved person, to Missouri. He worked on this farm. He wanted to be free. He walked, I believe, 5 miles. He had heard that the Confederates were going to, the Confederate leaning Missourians were going to destroy this bridge that the Union had to cross over. So I believe he walked 5 miles, warned the Union troops. They were able to repair the bridge so that they could get across it. So he had to flee. He fled to St. Louis. When he got to St. Louis, he was put in contact with William Greenleaf Eliot, the grandfather of T.S. Eliot, and the founder of Washington University. Eliot sheltered him. Pro-Confederate people came and violently beat him, and dragged him out of Eliot's house. Okay, but no, Eliot was one of the most prominent, William Greenleaf Eliot, Unitarian, anti-slavery, one of the most prominent St. Louisans. So he basically did everything he could to ensure that Archer Alexander could get out of prison. So finally, he was able to win his freedom, and at the very end of the war. He took a picture of Archer Alexander, right? He was one of the first taking all these pictures of former enslaved people, and sent the picture to Washington. This picture was used in a very famous statue of Abraham Lincoln, basically freeing an enslaved person. Now, Archer Alexander was never able to get to Washington to see his face, which is on this statue, and I don't think William Greenleaf Eliot was either. But it's sort of amazing, like all of that history is encoded in that face, in that statue, and no one really knew about this. And now the debate is, can we name a creek after Archer Alexander when there should be a statue, in downtown St. Louis? But I mean, I think that's sort of emblematic of how things have worked in the United States, and so I feel like my work is sort of or particularly Counternarratives, is in conversation with that, all those things embedded in that one story, which on the one hand is a remarkable story, and on the other hand is a very, very, I think, paradigmatic story of how American history has worked.
The way you talk about that story, and more generally about the lack of commemoration now, it sort of confirms the feeling that I have as I read Counternarratives, that you're working through contemporary issues, but not in a contemporary setting. And I would be interested to unpack that a little bit, particularly for writers who are listening, because when you were talking about writing annotations, you said that you originally wanted to write a traditional book that confronted the AIDS crisis, but that as a young writer, you couldn't find a way to tackle it as a project. That when you were older, you experienced that you were better able to incorporate things into a work, but you also realized that you don't have to write about things directly. So you do write about politics directly in your blog, Jay's Theater, whether it's about racism in the conceptual art world or specifically about Trump. And none of that is in counter-narratives, but it feels like it's in counter-narratives, strangely. So I was hoping maybe you could give some examples, if any come to mind, in counter-narratives of strategies you use to confront your contemporary concerns, but couching them in a different story altogether.
That's a great question. Well, to give one immediate example. So when I wrote the story on Brazil or denouement, I was deeply troubled by the George W. Bush administration. I have to say, I don't know why I am amazed by the American capacity to just, push things down a rabbit hole so that we don't, we completely forget them and then create a completely new narrative. It's like, oh, this was great, So now George W. Bush is this, benign, painting, kind of lovable character. And I think I saw, over 50% of, Democrats, think he's just terrific. I mean, and this was, it's almost impossible to put into words how horrible those 8 years of his tenure were. I mean, things are crazy now, but it was just abominable. Okay. So I think there was a certain moment, maybe 2002, and one way that I dealt with my desire to address the Iraq War and the horrors of the Bush administration was through this emotional outreach project that I'm going to talk about at Portland State today. The other way was to try and write about it, but I kept shutting down because I think in part also, too, the aftermath of 9/11 left me, I think clearly, millions of people, most Americans with a certain, kind of a profound trauma at what we'd witnessed. And then, of course, the sort of strange kind of non-investigation of it, et cetera. So when Tisa Bryant she and her co-editors were putting together the journal Encyclopedia, she gave me two words, Brazil and denouement, and it turned out, I think that we were really only supposed to use one word, but I went with two, and I think she also told me that Samuel Delaney, of all people, was the only other person who chose both words. But I mean, in that story, the family narrative, in part, I realized afterwards, is a narrative about the Bushes. Right, and the character of the Colonel is really, in certain ways, a kind of embodiment of what I saw. I mean, sort of Bush's ascent and to power, and all the outrage people felt. How can this person who really doesn't seem qualified? How can this person be, advancing to the presidency, and he becomes president even though he loses the popular vote? I mean, we've been here before, but and the violence that seemed to be unleashed, all these things I realized I was working through in that story, even as I was also working through thinking about the actual content of that story, and thinking about Brazil and its relation to the United States, and thinking about kind of slavery and its aftermath, and thinking about the effects of the past on the present. The fact that it's that Quilombo, that maroon little colony that's destroyed and the people are dispersed. I mean, what happens when you you enact violence and disperse and displace people, and then make it very difficult for their descendants ever to, fully reintegrate. Well, of course, that sometimes there's a kind of karmic payback that happens. But all those things are sort of in play. But it also is very much the mood of that story is drawn from that particular moment in time. And I didn't realize it at first, but now that I look at it, it's just so clear. And I think that, it also impressed upon me, that I've taught this essay a number of times, Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, right? Where he talks about the power of discourse. And you come to see that, I think clearly if you're reading something, you're not going to be, and most people aren't going to be reading it in a literary critical, in a sort of deep literary critical way. But I think that, one of the things that becomes clearer and clearer the older I get is, every work is, no matter what it looks like, is very much a product of its time. And that means that all of the various discourses that exist at that particular moment are in some ways shaping that work, even if the author isn't fully aware of it. So I think that that's just I think one immediate example of how the politics, the political mood, and my desire to create an artwork that was sort of resistant to that moment turned out to look like something that doesn't seem at all to be related, but very much is.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to writer John Keene about his latest work, Counternarratives. So in the blog Jay's Theater, where you do more of a headlong, direct confrontation into the politics of the day, you quote you quote the same quote from the journalist John Susskind from the 2004 election that Elliot Weinberger used in one of his books also, and which I discussed with him. And I'd be interested in discussing it with you because you mentioned one of the things about the Bush era was him creating this whole new reality and this whole new narrative. So the presidential aide to George Bush at the time shared with the journalist Susskind that guys like him, and by proxy us, were in what we call the reality-based community, which he defined as people who believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore, he continued. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. This reminded me of a voice in your last story, Lions, the only story that doesn't take place in America, and it's sort of, as you mentioned, a counterpoint. I'm just going to read this one quote. If I wanted your entire ancestral village to lie prone before me as I entered them one by one, if I wanted to raise the entire village and rape all the crushed and dismembered and burnt bodies, if I wanted to destroy every vestige of every single soul that spoke the same language as you and rape their ghosts, rape their ancestors who were my ancestors, if I wanted to rape the vestigial mothers and fathers of us all, if I wanted to rape the last embers of your existence and memory, and then what wasn't even left after that, I would have done so. I can write the story of reality however I see fit at any time. And obviously these aren't the same. One's a white American Republican espousing a philosophy coming full bloom, and another is a black African despotic leader. But they're both asserting not that power trumps the truth, but rather that power creates the truth. And I was just curious about your thoughts about that phenomenon, and maybe more specifically about writing or strategies of writing when you're living in the miasm of that post-factual phenomenon.
Right. Well, on the one hand, it's I think of it as coming straight out of someone like Plato, and his Republic, and his discussion of the leader, the tyrant, the ruler, and the power of creating reality. And of course, also Nietzsche. You can see this again and again. The idea of the Übermensch, the really sort of powerful figure who really is kind of beyond. Or operating sort of beyond human constraints, and also, has sort of rejected God and become a kind of God, right? And Nietzsche's idea that there sometimes is a reason to do this. I mean, I disagree with it, but yeah, I see that being a long strain in Western culture that sort of feeds into these ideas. I also, I think, am quite aware that I believe we had our first postmodern at the moment. People don't really talk about this, but at the moment when postmodernism was really kind of blazing in sort of literary and artistic culture, late 70s and 80s, we got our first postmodern president, Ronald Reagan. And I don't think we've ever recovered. It's like we keep getting more and more extreme examples every so often. We have a correction, and then we get, the next version. And now, of course, we have the kind of the ultimate postmodern nihilist in office. I think it's a challenge for writers. I think it's a challenge, because on the one hand, one of the things that writers fiction writers particularly, but poets as well, need to have in their toolkit is irony. But when you have people who are sort of so kind of off the charts that they almost render irony, I don't want to say irrelevant, but they basically almost drain it of all of its power. I mean, what do? Right? I mean, how do you capture a person who, for I'm thinking about our current moment, how do you capture a person who is on a certain level? I mean, I was listening to this interesting conversation this morning on the radio about, the whole gun control debate, which we have, it's not even every 10 years. It's like every 2 years or 3 years or something. We have these horrific mass slaughters that would, in most societies, would make, people act, make our representatives act. They would do the same thing, and they would look at, the Second Amendment and read it carefully and think about, okay, we need to keep our society safe. We need to keep our children safe. We need to keep our people safe. We've got to change the laws. Okay, so this is how most places have operated, right, and would and have operated. But here it's like, we get someone saying on the one hand, well, we're not gonna do anything. Then we hear, oh, we should just be able to take people's guns away. And then today it's like, well, no, I didn't really mean that. I meant, or he didn't mean that. I mean, it's just so crazy. It's like you can't even ironize that, right? Because it's almost beyond irony. So I think it poses a real challenge. I also think that, for example, with postmodernism, I understand the motivations for it. And I, of course, like everyone who, came along of a certain era, am a product of it. I also think, though, that we might want to kind of rethink. And this is happening, but I think what ends up happening is that it goes, people shift far to the right, and we have all of this, anti, identitarian discourse, and of course, everyone is identitarian in some way, form, or fashion. We might want to just kind of think through a bit more, and I think people are doing this, but maybe do it publicly. What the effects of the kind of postmodernist shift and turn have been, because at a certain level, it can be. I think we're seeing it's radically destabilizing. If we can't even agree on what objective truth is, and you have people actively militating against any notion of objectivity, right? So even if we kind of put it in quotations or are careful about what we say to be objectively true, we might say that, there is something to be said for verifiable facts. Not to say that's the only understanding of truth. But, I think we need to have a real public discussion of this, and we need people who are very smart. We need people who understand these, these issues, and people but also who can sort of speak with everyone, right? Who are not just talking to other academics, but can speak to a wider, public. Because I think, it's really beginning to take us to a very dangerous place. That we don't want to go past the point of no return. I don't think we're there, but I think writers and artists have to be part of that conversation and have to be. It really should be trying to figure out ways to get people thinking. And I think there are many writers and artists are doing that, which is an amazing thing. But we need to make sure that it's as visible as possible to as many people as possible.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question that I think is actually a bad question because it sets up a false binary. But
there are no bad questions.
I think it's bad nonetheless. But I'm going to ask it because I'm hoping it'll be productive or produce some interesting conversation. So, the last story that I just read that piece from, the contemporary African story, I wondered about that African despot when I think about leaders such as Robert Mugabe or Jacob Zuma or Charles Taylor, and some of which are espousing overtly anti-colonial revolutionary rhetoric, and yet are seen as deeply corrupt leaders. I wondered if you saw them and this despot in Lions and their failures as part of the legacy of colonialism.
Oh, yeah.
Or as a gesture like Ya Gyasi does in Homegoing, of where she looks at like the way Africans participated in the slave trade at the beginning, like a way of complicating the narrative of who's on what side, essentially.
Right. I see them as well. In I think both cases are important. So yes, I mean, and I think both of the figures actually talk about being anti-colonialist, and in fact, I was spurred in part by Robert Mugabe in particular. In fact, I play with some, one of his speeches in there, that really sort of powerful anti-colonial speech that one of the despots gives, one of the dictators gives. To basically say, I am the person who's going to defend this country. At the same time, right, we see that, right, there's a tradition that parallels colonialism and actually help, enable it, where, certain leaders are able to benefit from, helping to enslave their own people, helping to the colonizers to gain land and power, and they get something in return. So I think it's that duality I think is active. But part of what's also key here is this profound sense of betrayal. It's like we fought to be free, but you really, what you also really wanted was not for all of us to be free, but it was for yourself to gain as much money and power as you wanted, right? To become a kind of, sort of super potentate. And what's now happened is you're going to pay the ultimate price, right? So yeah, but I think that both the anti-colonial and sort of this parallel tradition are in play in that story.
Huh, interesting. Mm-hmm. I'd like to pivot to some of your other works. Sure. I sort of see them all as counter-narratives or dealing with counter-narratives. And I don't know if I'm forcing that, but for instance, annotations could be considered both an annotation to and a counter-narrative to your unwritten traditional memoir. Mm-hmm. But it's also a counter-narrative to the official history of St. Louis, mm-hmm. in a sense. But you've said about your more recent work that you feel like it's covering many of the same concerns as counter-narratives, but in a different way. Mm-hmm. And I would love to hear about the connective tissue you see between counter-narratives and, say, play, land, and grind. Like, mm-hmm. What through lines are there for you? Mm. Even though, we'll get to those pieces a little more specifically, but they're radically different projects mm-hmm. than counter-narratives on one level.
Yeah, I try not. I think it's sometimes important for me as an author an artist not to think so carefully about, how everything fits together, and because I feel like that starts to become, lead you towards thinking about, which some people do, and not to criticize them, but that's not so much my interest, about a career, and that there is this kind of through line or holism that I can apply to everything I do. But yeah, I think there is a kind of counter movement often in my work, even though it takes different, sort of appears in different genres and takes different forms. That is a kind of a recurrent component of it. So I would say, for example, Playland really is a collection of old and new poems. Many years ago, I had, it seemed like I was going to have a collection of, before Seismosis came out, a collection of poems appear, and it never happened. I hope it does happen at some point, because I have a lot of poems. But so that's a kind of collection of old and new poems, and yeah, some of the poems are more traditional in form. Some of them are more experimental, but I felt like they told a kind of story in concert with each other. So I think it works as a little collection. With Grind, that was just a terrific little project that I was able to work on with Nicholas Milner after a summer at Image Text Ithaca with Nicholas and Catherine Taylor, who just created an amazing MFA program there. And it was that's really sort of conceptual writing, because it's language that's culled from the Grindr app. And I was just amazed and sort of just fascinated and amazed at, on the one hand, how revealing the language could be, and also how vulnerable it could be. how banal it could be, but also at a certain level how assertive, people seem to think it was to say certain things. And so putting it together, I realized, this, like so many things out there, you have poetry here, depending on how you sort of read it and arrange it. And Nicholas had these amazing photographs, and he actually has done a much bigger book that it has some text in it. But he had these amazing photographs, and we realized they kind of worked together because the photographs are doing something very similar to the text. So we came up with that. But yeah, it is a kind of counter-narrative of, like, I don't know, those apps that are out there that, everyone is using and ranting about and everything else.
Well, one of the things that was interesting specifically to Grind, well, maybe first you could just tell people who don't know what the Grind app is, what it is.
It's Grindr, right? So it's like many of these apps, like it's a kind of gay Tinder. There are a number of these apps, but Grindr is I don't know if it's still a big one, but it was one of the big ones, or has been a big one, and it's a gay dating app, and or friendship app, or sex app, or depending on who's using it, where people just post their profiles, and the profiles have, people describe themselves. They have often this, to me, fascinatingly absurd language in them. You could, and of course, even before, I would say this, even before the apps, there have always been sites like this. There's sites on the internet where people are looking for, you see this on, maybe not so much on Facebook, but I think about, like, for example, earlier sites that I used to belong to, like High Five or Friendster, or even, very neutral sites like, Ello, or what was it? It was another one that was supposed to be kind of anti, establishment. But anyway, so people put these sort of little statements about themselves and what they're looking for, And sometimes they're, really quite interesting, witty, but sometimes they're just absolutely absurd. And so I realized, if you start to cull a lot of these it's like if you were going through Twitter or something, you get a lot of really fascinating things that people are saying about themselves, and you put them all together, and you have a completely something new. So that's basically what I was doing. And I do that a lot. I will go through the internet. I've been doing this for quite some time now, and just collecting little snippets of language and stuff. And, at some point, maybe I'll use it. At some point, I won't. But, with Grind, it actually just worked out that we both had kind of done something very similar with using different media. And when we put it together, we had a little book.
Well, one of the ways it feels like it deals with counter identities is literally all of the faces are erased. They're
pixelated out,
or erased or blurred or smeared. So we don't see the faces in the photos.
Right.
And the words sort of serve as this other face for the person. But there's also often the paradox that some of the words are often like, please have a face, or I do have a face pic. So we have like the presentation in the image of how the person wants to be seen without their face. And then we have the words, which are another counter narrative to the image in a way. Like, please have a face. I do have a face pic, even though my face isn't here.
Right. Well, the interesting thing too is that many of those images that Nicholas pulled up. It's fascinating because they're so revealing in certain ways. Like, people will have their behinds and their asses in the air or something, or they'll be like, spread out nude on a bed. So and you can see what's in the room and everything like that, but their face is pixelated out. And I think it's what I found fascinating about a lot of this language is it's both concealing and revealing, right? It's saying very much about, in very few words, about who that person is, but you still don't know who that person is, right? So none of this is akin to actually meeting and talking to someone in person and actually interacting with them. But this is it's sort of fascinating because this is where we're kind of moving towards, right? This kind of virtual world of virtual relationships of all kinds. I think about how I was just reading, young people posting images of themselves on, I think, a Snapchat with these filters that allow you to, basically Photoshop your face or change your face, your features and stuff like that. And so you have all these sort of young people now thinking, okay, well I want to look more like the picture. Or I want to look like someone else's picture, because I want to be like that. Not I want to be like that person. So I have to get a nose job, or because the photograph shows my nose to be too big, I have to get my nose. I mean, so it's like, but there's no real conversation going on between. It's like I'm looking at this and I'm developing a kind of sense of self based on virtuality, which I just find really fascinating. But I mean, I guess it's happened in different ways in the past. But I think we're in a new moment. And so I think some of that is captured in that book.
Well, I would love people to hear a couple of poems. It feels like Playland in a way is a hinge between counter-narratives and grind. Like when I think of like the romantic encounter in counter-narratives between Langston Hughes and Javier Villaurrutia. Villaurrutia, thank you. And then the anonymous encounters in grind. You have this poem that feels like a hinge. Try to remember that South African man. Mm-hmm. And I would love it if you don't mind reading that, and maybe also Suit, which also feels like a different interrogation of identity.
Sure. Okay. So this is called Try to Remember That South African Man. Sometimes I try to remember the name of that South African man who insisted on being called colored, even though in this country he would have qualified as black. He was more attached to that identification than any other, such as older, dapper, tourist, uncut, speaks Afrikaans, wears glasses. His hair slept under my fingers like lamb's wool. He could tongue longer than any guy I'd come across thus far. What did we talk about as we lay on the comforter in his hotel room? Getting around Boston on foot. How we'd both considered studying architecture. Apartheid over there, racism here, especially how black Americans had achieved so much in comparison, how we seemed to take everything for granted. Back and forth. Imagine if just bitching about inadequate schools and lack of housing could land you at the bottom of a ditch, he asked me. But it happens here too, I protested. He smiled. Respect your elders, even if they're lovers. Be quiet now. And then his palm covered my mouth and nose, leaving only a tiny slit for me to breathe. This is how they held me before they began to beat me, he said. Then he rained down another round of kisses. And this poem is called Suit. And I'll just mention, it's for Phil Horvitz, who I worked with. He was a wonderful work companion. He was hilarious and brilliant. And it also refers to his a set of performances by his former boyfriend, Nayland Blake, who would dress up in a bunny suit and dance and dance and dance. Suit. If sorrow is a suit, its weight is incalculable. One day he's gone, and you put it on. One day he's gone, and it sews itself inside you. Morning drapes your skin in its invisible fabric. Every memory furs atop a prior memory. Your limbs, your features, your senses extend themselves to accommodate the sadness. One morning you wake and try to wear this new suit in the bathroom or the bedroom, in the shower or at the front door, down the stairs of the stoop to the walkway hovering before you, and you finally realize you are carrying another body, his body, your former body, your bodies together, in and on you, and this slows you and stills you, weighs more than two bodies or many bodies inside your body. It's like the bodies are breeding bodies, metastasizing bodies. So much bone and vein and hair, and you touch the force, the heat of the seething arteries, feel the sheer new tonnage moving and pressing in on you, grief sent like the first breath in a foreign country, and you fear your entry, but you're already in. You think of flight, but woe offers no exit. You sing, you weep, you dance, but there's no way out, except one, through your own skin. This one, heavy with sweat, matted, half shed and broken by a delta of scars, smelling of something familiar, indiscernible and animal, slick and smoldering like volcanic rock, as white as ash and death itself. Take it. You take it. You take it off.
We've been listening to John Keene read poems from his collection Playland. I was hoping maybe you'd read one from Grind just so people can hear how tonally different and totally different the crafted found language sounds.
Okay, well, I should say that this is actually a one long complete poem. So I'll read a few excerpts. And the thing I should say about Grind is it's written in 2 columns, so you can read it both, straight down each column or across or zigzag, set up so that you can read it in those multiple ways. So I'll just read a few little sections. What are you really looking for? A little banter? Some company? I'm bored with quality, being me. I can be friendly. I don't discriminate. I just don't cling to certain personalities. Whatever you like, massage, music, stretching, wrestling friends, I want to meet to hook up. The measure of a man, what you do with power or the absence of it. Please have a face, picture for chatting. Your muscles mean nothing. Travel for work, crisscrossing the country. If this sounds like you, hit me up. No agenda, along for the ride. Crank it up, looking to get hot and steamy. Does anyone go on dates these days? Exploring possibilities. I like bears or the idea of bears. I appreciate those who read, buy, discreet guys, open profiles, love to laugh and laugh to love. And here's another version. What are you? A little banter? I'm bored being me. I don't discriminate. Really looking for some company with quality. I can be friendly. I just don't cling to certain personalities. Whatever you like. I want to meet the measure of a man or the absence of it. Picture, massage, music, stretching, wrestling friends to hook up. What you do with power. Please have a face for chatting. Your muscles travel for work. If this sounds like no agenda, crank it up. Meaning nothing, crisscrossing the country, you hit me up, along for the ride, looking to get hot and steamy. Does anyone go exploring possibilities? I appreciate those bi open profiles. On dates these days, I like bears or the idea of bears who read. Discreet guys love to laugh and laugh to love.
We've been listening to John Keene read from Grind. I love that. I love bears and the idea of bears. That's really good. So you've taught a class on the Black literary avant-garde, temples for the future 20th and 21st century. Mm-hmm. And you've talked about how you feel like the aims are different between the avant-garde and the Black avant-garde. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit to that for us today?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, let me just say there was an amazing conference. I didn't go to it, but I did read the sort of transcript of it. It appeared in Tripwire, organized by Giovanni Singleton and Renee Gladman in the early 2000s. And it was on the Black avant-garde. And just a really, just beautiful, beautiful, essays, poems, some fiction by people like, of course, Renee and Giovanni and Nathaniel Mackey and Wanda Coleman and Lorenzo Thomas, Harriet Mullen, et cetera. So really, really, Mark McMorris, really just terrific people. I feel like for the Black avant-garde, the sort of aims of the avant-garde are always there, but there's another kind of project which is really centered on freedom and resistance, and you see this again and again and again in the work of what we might call the Black avant-gardes. I would say sort of alongside this, and I should also mention that there was another beautiful, and I think you can even find this online, a transcript. There's a transcript of a conversation. It was an internet conversation, email conversation that Evie Shockley and I believe Terrence Hayes did for Jubilat, that also a more recent one, conversation about the Black avant-garde. That was also, I think, in the mid-2000s. This idea of a particular idea is about freedom, liberation, equality, sort of challenging the status quo, challenging respectability, to sort of rethink possibilities for expression and selfhood, being, are essential to the Black avant-garde. And again and again and again, we see, that there's a kind of overtly, well, the avant-garde has sort of woven into it. I think Linda Noklin suggests when she's talking about sort of the origins of the French avant-garde, like a political component. But then, she mentions how, for example, with David, there's this overt, political project, and then by the time we get to Manet, right, the politics have sort of been evacuated, but the kind of sending up of the bourgeoisie, this joke of the blog, I think she uses the term blague, is sort of takes the place of the politics. With the Black avant-garde, I think the politics are always there, and we think of these various moments and figures, and I think that's something we can never forget, right? The Black arts movement was not just about changing language and transforming the literature, but it was an overtly political, intervention that's still in many ways with us, right, and still needed, right, even as we critique some of the components of it,
Well, I wanted to ask you about that in relationship to some of what you've written about racism in the white conceptual art world. Mm-hmm. When I think of Kenneth Goldsmith's remixing and performance of The Autopsy of Michael Brown, or Vanessa Place's project of tweeting the racist lines from Gone with the Wind, mm-hmm. You've written about this, mm-hmm. but unlike some other people that I've seen engage with it who've been on the show, like, for instance, Yun Song Kim would argue that I believe that there's something inherent in the aesthetics of conceptual art and an abstraction itself. Maybe it's this evacuation of the politics. Mm-hmm. That is the problem. But it feels like in your writing on your blog that you condemn the projects wholesale, mm-hmm. but at the same time, you seem to suggest that the conceptual practice remains a valuable path mm-hmm. in the contemporary imaginative culture. So it feels like you're carving out a slightly different position than mm-hmm. a lot of people who would argue perhaps that it's rotten down to something at its core, mm-hmm. rather than the practitioners who are using it in a certain way. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about conceptual practice maybe in ways that you see don't do what Kenneth Goldsmith and Vanessa Place did, but are of interest to you?
Sure. Well, okay. Let me just say this: that so I critiqued specific projects that Kenneth Goldsmith and Vanessa Place engaged in. At the same time, I actually do think there is something valuable, for example, in some of Kenneth Goldsmith's work. That doesn't mean that I don't think he's deeply problematic in a lot of ways. But I think, so let me just mention, for example, someone like Dorothy Wong in her book. She wrote this brilliant study, Thinking Its Presence. And Dorothy kind of gets at this in multiple ways when she's talking about Asian American poetry and a number of controversies that have attended major Asian American poets and that have also involved the white avant-garde. And so I'm sort of thinking of her work when I would make the statement that when we think about a kind of contemporary white conceptual practice, right, part of it has allowed some of its figures to not deal with things like race, right? And we could say even some of the critics of it, they don't have to deal with, not only do they not deal with black conceptualists or conceptual writers at all, or writers of color at all who are doing conceptual work, but it almost allows you to kind of sidestep history. On the other hand, I think it's important to keep in mind that if we look at conceptual practice in the United States, some of its really important figures are people of color. You have people, so really early on in the 50s, like Benjamin Patterson and Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono is it's sort of a major person that you can't just erase, right? And you move into the late 60s and 70s, you have someone like Adrian Piper or Charles Gaines, et cetera. So, to me, I think that to to cast conceptual practice, conceptual art, conceptual writing, solely as a kind of white thing and a thing that does not deal with, a race, gender, sexuality, etc., is deeply problematic, because I think if you look kind of into the history and you're sort of aware of how things have developed, you see that there was a lot more being done than this current moment, right? Or which isn't even so much current anymore, but that was current in the late 90s and early 2000s. And, it's almost like they've been able to kind of claim the mantle of what conceptual practice is, even though it's only this one, kind of a moment in this much longer and richer history.
Can you talk a little bit about your emotional outreach exercises and the project in general? I know you're going to Portland State after this to talk about it more, but is this an avant-garde practice of yours? Would you place it in the avant-garde, in the Black avant-garde? And what is it?
Sure. Well, it's deeply informed by people like Adrian Piper, Patterson, Alan Caprow. It began with me creating a set of cards that I would give out for free. So on the one hand, the cards, I called the cards vouchers because I was thinking of, being in this very neoliberal moment that's, still with us and seems to be, getting stronger and stronger every day. But on the other hand, my idea was that the cards would be given out free, my name, I think I had a kind of pseudonym and then my initials, but my name is not on them. I didn't even want to know. I kind of wanted to know, but didn't at another level want to know what people did with them. So I gave kind of gentle instructions. And what they were, the first version and sort of various iterations involved me coming up with a set of emotions on one side, and I called it a free emotional voucher. And then I give the cards out, and on the back, they say something along the lines of, this is this little gift to you, and you can use this either A, if you need this emotion, right? So if you need to feel a happiness or love or hope and you don't feel it, you can carry it with you. You can create a little ritual where you kind of draw upon the power of this card and everything and this emotion, what it represents. Or you can give it to someone who you feel needs it, if they need to feel hope. Some of the other cards and is more negative emotions, like hate, rage, indifference, right? Something a little bit more neutral. You could then take that, and if you felt like you felt too much rage, okay, then you could you could burn it, you could tear it up, you could bury it, you could put it in an envelope and mail it. I don't know, do something with it, right? Right. But you could sort of use it as a kind of material correlative to that emotion, or to draw it out of yourself, or to flush it yourself of it. And so I was giving these out for free, and I did it in a lot of different places. And there have been various versions. I created some in Spanish for when I trip to Cuba, some in German, and that also were had German and Yiddish for 2 exhibits in Germany, or one exhibit in Germany, and then given some out, various versions out in New York. And then the newest versions are what I call emotional exercises, and I'm going to talk about that today. And they are kind of like random acts of kindness, although I thought of this before, random acts of kindness. But they're not only, about kind acts, because some of them are very self-directed. But again, ways to access our emotions, because, we have often operated under this idea that, man is the rational animal, or humans are rational animals. But I think we probably more accurate thing to say is we're sometimes rational, but we're always emotional. So.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I wish we had a ton of time to talk about you as a translator. I want to at least point people to your great article at the Poetry Foundation website, Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness. That argues that we need more translations of literary works from non-Anglophone Black diasporic authors into English. And I would guess you probably, the unspoken thing here, or maybe it was spoken there, is that it would probably be beneficial to have more Black translators also in the United States. Which feels like a way to reverse erased narratives, obviously, too, because like Daniel Berzutski says in the introduction, most people don't even know that there are Black writers in Pakistan or in Iraq, or there are Black people in Pakistan and Iraq.
Right.
But I was wondering maybe if Juan, you could point to any translations that you're particularly excited to for listeners, and then also if you could touch on the idea of not just translating Black writers from languages other than English into English, but the notion of Blackness, since it's a constructed notion. Like if you're translating, I know you translate Portuguese, like if you're translating a Black experience in Brazil, there's also going to be some gap between what Black is or I presume there's a gap between what Black is in the United States and what it is in Brazil.
Well, yeah, I mean, so just quickly, so I'm affiliated with the African Poetry Book Fund, which is based at the University of Nebraska. It's an amazing group of people. And I think one of the translators who's doing some terrific work is Todd Fredson. He's going to be, I think, several of his books actually have come up. He translated the Ivorian poet Josue Gebo, and then Tanya Boney is another one whose work is going to be out, or might actually, it'll be out very soon. There are a number of really extraordinary translators from Spanish out there, Afro-Cuban writers. Kirsten Dijkstra is one of the ones who's done some just really amazing work. I mean, there's some really great people. Antenna, I know, is looking to publish translations soon of Garifuna author. So yeah, I think this work is happening, and it's very exciting. And I should say that before I wrote Translating Poetry, Translating Blackness, I think a few years ago at AWP and at other places, I've tried to advocate for translating all writers of all backgrounds, particularly writers of color of different backgrounds who are not being translated into English, because of course what ends up happening is if you translate it into English, that increases your likelihood of being translated into other languages around the globe, because of the English language market is so big and so powerful. In terms of Blackness, yeah, I mean it's a complex question. I mean I also translate from French and Spanish, and I've translated. So, for example, I've translated the Dominican writer Mateo Morrison. I've translated Alain Maboncourt, the great, very, very famous now contemporary Congolese French author. And I mean, it's really sort of interesting to see how they are working through ideas of Blackness. But what becomes clear is that there is a kind of conversation that's always happening because of the circulation of culture and cultures, right? So it's nothing is static, right? And people often, the thing I think really I find very powerful is that people overseas are often very aware of what's going on in the U.S., whereas we tend not to be so aware because, of course, we're more of a centripetal society. People come here, we travel, but right, we don't. But it's, and of course the gatekeepers don't let a lot of stuff in. You have to hunt for it. I mean, it gets here, but we have to hunt for it. But I mean, it's sort of fascinating to see how these conversations and dialogues are always happening, and even sort of ways that people talk about themselves. So the use of the term Black alongside noir, let's say, or negro and preto in Portuguese, or negro and preto in Spanish, right? I think it's just so interesting, right? When that English term appears and what that means, or what that signifies, and the kind of power and resistance that it contains. These are all things I think are very interesting. Yeah.
So what can we expect from you next? I know at one point you had talked about wanting to write counter-narratives through the civil rights movement and up into the present. Is that the next book that we're going to see, or is there something else that we're going to see next?
No, that's not. Maybe at some point. I'm working on two prose projects. I think Samuel Delaney once pointed out that it's probably not a good idea to talk too much about things that aren't done. But yeah, I have two prose projects. I guess you could call them novels. So I hope to finish them sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being on the show today, John.
Thank you so much, David.
We're talking today to writer, poet, and translator John Keene about his books Counternarratives, Playland, and Grind. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, at kboo.fm. More of John Keene's work can be found at his blog, Jay's Theater, at jstheater.blogspot.com. You can also find his addition to the growing archive of bonus material at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, where John Keene reads from his out-of-print poetry chapbook, Playland, and a new poem called Words. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog E Sapatita Mi, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.